Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to be exploring the fascinating subject of time travel. My guest is Dr. Reza Jorjani, a philosopher and author of many books, including Prometheus and Atlas, World State of Emergency, Lovers of Sophia, Novel Folklore, and Iranian Leviathan. Welcome, Jason.
It's great to be with you again, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure, as always, to be with you, Jason. When we think of time travel, the first thing that comes to mind is all of the many science fiction stories and movies and episodes of Star Trek and other, Doctor Who, for example, that address this question. It's one that's fascinated people ever since I can remember.
Yeah, there are two works of science fiction that I find particularly fascinating that have to do with time travel because they approach time travel from the angle of parapsychology rather than in terms of mechanistic time machine. And these are the novel by Jack Finney, Time and Again, and the film La Jetée by Chris Marker. And the really interesting thing about Jack Finney's novel Time and Again is that it was published in 1970, which is a few years before the CIA started secretly developing the remote viewing program at the Stanford Research Institute. This is interesting because the program that's laid out for time travel in this sci-fi novel by Jack Finney is very much like what winds up becoming the protocol in the remote viewing program. It's a U.S. government program that's depicted in this novel that uses clairvoyance and astral projection in order to send people backwards into time. And in particular, they have this interesting idea of creating simulacra of places in the past. And so they set this room up. The people working in this government program set this room up just as it would have been in the 1800s. And they even introduced certain smells that were distinctive of the period, like certain kind of tobacco smell and so forth. And they dress this time traveler in period-appropriate clothing and use a certain hypnotic suggestion protocol to actually they teach him a kind of auto-hypnosis. And he suggests himself into the past and walks out of that hotel room into the 1800s. And then we also see in La Jetée, the film by Chris Marker, psychic phenomena used as a method of time travel. This is a film about a group of survivors of the Third World War who are living in galleries underneath the Palais de Chaillot in Paris, where not incidentally the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted by the United Nations after the Second World War. And these survivors are prisoners of war being held, it appears, by Germans. And the German captors are carrying out various experiments on them to try to see if they can send people into the past, because it seems there are suggestions that space has been closed off to the survivors of this nuclear war, that either Earth is under a quarantine or space travel technology doesn't exist anymore. So the only way out of this incredibly bleak future is backwards into the past. And they use a method of sensory deprivation, extreme sensory deprivation, together with hypnosis, to get a prisoner of war to focus on a particularly vivid memory from his past, from his childhood, and astral project himself into that moment. And the moment that he finds himself in is a memory of having witnessed a man being shot to death as he's running toward a horrified woman on the pier or jetty, la jetée of Orly Airport in Paris. And it turns out, to make a long story short, that he's witnessing his own death, because later in the same film he goes AWOL, as it were. He goes off the reservation, as they put it in the military, and the time cops of this future civilization come after him, and they assassinate him on the pier of that airport after he has developed a romantic relationship with this woman who he's fascinated by, in these various attempts that they make to send him into the past. So these are two works of science fiction, literature, and film that approach time travel from the perspective of parapsychology.
And I think it's fair to say they're both much more imaginative than what actually takes place, for example, in the remote viewing laboratory.
Yes, although there are a few cases that I am aware of from the history of remote viewing, which when you put them together suggest that Joe McMoneagle may have been justified in calling remote viewing the ultimate time machine.
Mm-hmm.
For example, there was a case where there was an operation where, in order to study the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing over Lockerbie, Scotland, they sent someone onto the airplane. They had someone, clairvoyantly view the airplane at the moment in the past where this terrorist attack occurred. And, there's a phenomenon in remote viewing where instead of simply clairvoyantly describing a target, the viewer gets completely immersed in the site. And they refer to this as bilocation, and it's discouraged because the viewers who enter this kind of state, which in the old days they called astral projection, can't readily communicate information to the interviewer in the remote viewing session, and the interviewer who's tasked with guiding them and helping to get
because
data
the feeling
out of them.
is not that they're viewing; the feeling is that they're there.
And in this case, it appears that somehow the remote viewer really was there because, first of all, he found out that there was a secondary explosive on the airplane, and it was hidden in chocolate bars brought onto the aircraft by an Iranian woman who was taking vengeance for a relative of hers having been killed in the United States Navy downing of an Iran Air civilian airliner some months earlier in the same year. But at the moment that the airplane started breaking apart after this secondary explosive was detonated, the remote viewer witnessed people standing up out of their bodies, their spectral bodies standing up inside the aircraft and turning around and looking toward him. And they had these looks of despair and horror on their faces, because these really searching, questioning gazes directed at him, because they could tell that he knew what was going on, what was happening to them, that they couldn't understand. And so it suggests that somehow he was, at least in the form of a ghost, present on this aircraft, in the aisle of this aircraft. Now, there's another case from the earliest days of the remote viewing program at SRI, where Russell Tarragon and Harold Puthoff sent a remote viewer into a particle accelerator in the physics department at Stanford. And the idea was to just describe what was going on inside the particle accelerator. But the remote viewer felt like the particles were traveling through him, and there was actually a massive malfunction of the particle accelerator that required significant maintenance. Unfortunately, the physics department never found out that it was Tarragon Puthoff that, were responsible for this until years later when they revealed this information. But this suggests that not only is bilocation possible, it's also possible to psychokinetically affect the environment in this state. And when you combine those two things, travel to the past or potentially to the future using astral projection or extreme clairvoyance, bilocation, and psychokinesis, then effectively you wound up with a method of time travel and a method of time travel where it's possible to affect the past or the future.
Now, I parenthetically might add, though, that particular incident in the particle accelerator, the Stanford Linear Accelerator, is sort of anecdotal. It's not the best proof of psychokinesis. It might have been in any single incident a coincidence.
I suppose so.
Yeah.
It would be an extraordinary coincidence.
But there's plenty of other evidence for psychokinesis.
There is, and it's hard to see any reason why, if psychokinesis is possible in the present and remote viewing is possible both in the present and in the past and the future, why it wouldn't be possible if you have a total immersion experience in the past to psychokinetically affect the past.
It's known as retrocognitive psychokinesis.
Mm-hmm. And, there are spontaneous time slips that people have reported in the history of psychical literature. One particularly prominent case was described by a particularly prominent episode was described by Whitley Strieber in his book Breakthrough, where he was walking on a Manhattan sidewalk and all of a sudden started to get various sensory input. Not just visual, but smells and sounds, and sounds that were from like a different time frame. Mm-hmm. And so he started to hear this carriage creaking, from behind one of his ears and smell pickles. And next thing he knows, he sees there's a pickle barrel on the sidewalk and a carriage narrowly misses him. And people who are walking on the sidewalk jump back startled as if he appeared from out of nowhere. And he sees that he is on the same sidewalk, but apparently in the 1800s, with people disconcerted by his clothing and so forth. And this only took place for a few moments. But he had other episodes like that, and it really makes you wonder about all these cases of missing persons. David Polides has studied many of the missing persons cases that are reported every year, and found that some of them are utterly bizarre, like cases where hikers are forming a line up a mountain, and there's a fixed interval in between them, and one hiker goes around a bend, and then the hiker behind him, when he goes around the same bend, he sees that the person walking ahead of him is missing, and this person just disappears from out of the line of hikers. If there's snow in the environment, no footprints, no sound of any altercation with an animal or the person being dragged off by anyone or abducted. So you have to wonder, where are these people disappearing to? Are these instances of spontaneous slips in time?
You're suggesting that there might be naturally occurring, let's call them time portals, that occasionally people, unbeknownst to themselves, just slip through and don't come back.
Yeah, there have been some serious studies of the Bermuda Triangle phenomenon, for instance, where there are cases of some of the aircraft and naval vessels that have gone missing into the Bermuda Triangle being seen in that area again decades later. And there are there's a whole mass of evidence of archeological artifacts that are misplaced in time, that are anomalous, temporally anomalous. For example, gold chain, hand-worked gold chain inside a slab of stone, or an iron cup in a huge lump of coal, or a zinc alloy vase with floral pattern on it, discovered in mines in Idaho and Nebraska and Oklahoma at depths that would suggest these objects are anywhere from 200 to 600 million years old. Yeah. There was in 1922, there was a shoe print discovered in shale that was hundreds of millions of years old, where the shoe was stepping on trilobites. Some of these very early reports that I was describing of objects found in large lumps of coal and gold chains and rock and so forth were reported in magazines like Scientific American or in newspapers of the caliber of the London Times in the 1840s, 1850s. Before the paleontological and anthropological orthodoxy had really taken hold.
Yeah. Well, I've done a couple of interviews with Michael Cremo, the co-author with Richard Thompson of the book Forbidden Archaeology. They tend to assume that this evidence points to their hypothesis that the human race is much older than normal Darwinian theory would be able to account for. You're suggesting it might be evidence of some form of time travel.
Exactly. I think it's more reasonable to us, and it's also less bleak and pessimistic to assume that these artifacts are evidence for time travel, even if it's accidental time travel, people who slipped through portals in space-time or weaknesses in the fabric of space-time, than it is to suggest this is evidence for vastly ancient human civilization. Mm-hmm. Because if we reach one of these finds was deep inside a mine. They found, at a strata of hundreds of millions of years old, they found a 26-foot long polished concrete wall. If this is evidence that we had that level of civilization hundreds of millions of years ago, and it's fallen perhaps many times, and we've been reduced to barbarism and savagery and had to build ourselves back up again over and over the course of hundreds of millions of years, that's an extremely bleak and pessimistic view of human history, if you ask me. It's very consonant with Cremo and Thompson's worldview because they're both part of the, what do they call it? International Society of Krishna Consciousness.
Yeah, the Hare
Krishna movement.
Yeah.
And so they subscribe to the cyclical Hindu view of history, which I've always seen as a terribly pessimistic and bleak view. That doesn't encourage progressive development into the future. At any rate, I think rather than calling into question the Darwinian theory of evolution, this kind of evidence would best be interpreted as a corroboration of time travel.
At least of objects.
Yeah, well, they're objects left behind by people.
Or they might have been sort of
apports.
They could have been apported.
Well,
I mean, when you find an object like that embedded in a piece of coal or in stone somewhere.
Yes, but the shoe prints are clearly, made by people. A shoe is not going to teleport itself and step on trilobites. So, and one of these shoe prints actually has a worn sole, where right where the heel is inside the shoe, the sole appears to have been worn through, and it's in a strata of rock that's contemporaneous with the dinosaurs. Mm-hmm. Of course, these simple-minded creationists use these things to argue that the world is only 5,000 years old, and the dinosaurs, were contemporaneous with a man that's of only biblical antiquity. But I think it's more reasonable to see this as evidence for time travel, and the significance of that is that even if these slips in time occurred accidentally, it suggests that on an ontological level, time travel is possible. Mm.
Well, obviously, it raises many questions for a philosopher such as yourself.
The standard, question that's posed here is the grandfather paradox that, if someone were to be able to travel back into the past and to alter it, it's conceivable that they would set in motion a chain of events that would prevent them from even having been born. And so, logicians and analytic philosophers have raised objections to the idea that it's possible to change the past. They think that, if time travel occurs, the only things that can happen in the past have to be things that are consistent with history as it's recorded now. So there can be time loops, but not changes to the timeline.
And I gather this is a problem that people such as even Aristotle puzzled over.
Yeah, Aristotle argued, and then Thomas Aquinas, his medieval scholastic disciple, argued that even God, or the highest intelligence, could not change the past, that God would be, as it were, violating his own laws to change the past. And from Aquinas' perspective, that this would be an affront to the omnipotence and omniscience of God, because, presumably God could get it right the first time. But then there were people like Saint Damien who heretically argued that God can revise and perfect the past. Which I would say is actually much more consistent with a Gnostic worldview than with any form of Catholicism. Though he was a Catholic saint, I think that view presumes that God is not omniscient and omnipotent, and that the divine needs to carry out remedial actions suggests a kind of imperfect divinity that's consistent with the Gnostic demiurge more than it is with Catholic theology.
Well, it suggests to me that perhaps from the perspective of God, past, present, and future are very different than how they appear to humans.
Yeah, that's possible. One person who did take this Gnostic perspective and who seriously considered time travel was Philip K. Dick, who, he confessed ultimately that the world he depicts in The Man in the High Castle, where the Axis powers have won the Second World War, was based on fragmentary memories of an alternate timeline that he had, and he thought that there was a Gnostic savior of sorts, a Valis, a vast active living intelligence system that was trying to beneficently rewrite history and countermand the programming of these archons that were trying to control humanity. The thing about Dick and The Man in the High Castle that's interesting is that it was developed into a television series relatively recently, where there's a portal in time that's been created in rural Pennsylvania, where the Nazis who have won the Second World War have discovered our world, our timeline, and are trying to cross through this portal into our world to secure a victory here as well. And I find that interesting because there is some disturbing evidence that toward the end of the Second World War, 1943-44, the Germans were working on a technology that could warp the fabric of space-time. And I have to wonder whether the people who wrote this show based on Philip K. Dick's novel are alluding to this.
Otherwise, it might be an interesting synchronicity.
It might be.
Yeah. Didn't the great logician Kurt Gödel also weigh in on the question of whether it's possible to change the past?
He did, and talk about an analytically minded person. He did think that it was possible to change the past, despite all these objections from analytic philosophers. He did think it's possible to change the past. And, one thing, though, that I think often isn't considered is that if it were possible to do so, it would make a time machine the ultimate weapon. Because, if you're engaged in a battle with an enemy, that is intractable, the best way to defeat them is to go back into the past and prevent them from ever existing. And this kind of science fictional scenario is what you see in Fritz Lieber's novel, The Big Time. He calls it the Change War. And there are these two factions, the spiders and the serpents, that both have time travel technology. And they are waging a war against each other in order to ultimately prevent with each side aiming to ultimately prevent their enemy from ever having come into existence. And it's peculiar that it's not. I think he did it deliberately. Lieber basically suggests that the spiders are time traveling Nazis, and indeed the post-war international cabal of SS officers that evacuated a lot of personnel and material to Argentina and were involved in negotiating the paperclip extraction of Nazi scientists in the United States were referred to as the Spider. So I think that he's getting this from that. But I think Lieber might also have been aware of this project that I referenced earlier.
It's called the Nazi Bell, as I recall.
Yes, well, it was called the Bell because it was a bell-shaped device, but the project was named Kronos, Project Kronos, which is an obvious reference to the Lord of Time in classical Greek mythology. And this was a research and development project outside of Prague in Czechoslovakia, Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia, run by Hans Kammler. And this device, it was a bell-shaped device about 9 to 12 feet tall, and it had two counter-rotating drums inside of it filled with a mercury-thorium isotope, with a constant supply of alternating current electricity and intermittent shocks of direct current electricity. And the idea is that just the way that certain isotopes of uranium and plutonium can yield a nuclear fission or fusion reaction, this particular isotope of mercury-thorium, when subjected to certain electromagnetic stresses, would open up a vortex, would create a supermassive vortex. And this would distort the space-time continuum around the object.
And this is something that's been postulated by scholars who have looked into this history.
Yeah, Nick Cook, a British aerospace journalist, has looked into this and the hunt for 0 point, with the idea being that this was an early 0-point energy device. And Joseph Farrell has done extensive research on this and on the political organization that survived the end of the Second World War and continued this trajectory of technological development in Argentina and potentially elsewhere. But this is relevant to time travel because the experiments that they carried out on the Bell included experiments where plants and other organic material was placed around the Bell. Mm-hmm. And after the machine was turned off, they saw that these plants and other organisms experienced rapid cellular degeneration. They sort of just collapsed from within, decayed rapidly. And there's a suggestion that this is due to some kind of a disruption on a molecular level to the space-time continuum for these organisms, because the humans the first generation of scientists who were involved in the project also experienced a significant distortion in their sense of the flow of time. It seemed as if time was flowing at a different rate for them inside the laboratory than for people outside. And in fact, a number of these first generation of scientists on the project had various types of organ failure and died. And so later they took more rigorous precautions to protect people from the effects of the Bell, people meaning the scientists. And then they also brought, unfortunately, concentration camp inmates within the Bell enclosure and studied the effects of this on the human organism more directly. But this is an interesting it's an interesting episode in relation to time travel when you consider the Kecksburg UFO event in 1965. In December of 1965, where this acorn-shaped object was discovered in rural Pennsylvania. Rural Pennsylvania, the same place that in the Man in the High Castle series, they've set this Nazi space-time portal. In Kecksburg, local witnesses described an object that is almost exactly like the Bell. I mean, a upside-down acorn looks like a bell shape.
And about the same size.
And about the same size, almost exactly, the same size.
What was that size?
It's varied in description from 9 to 12 feet. Mm-hmm. About 10 feet or so in height. Not very large. And the curious thing about the descriptions at Kecksburg is that there was a ring of writing around the bottom, around the lip of the acorn or the, rim of the bell. There was a ring of writing that was described as similar to hieroglyphics, but not hieroglyphics. And some of the witnesses of the bell said that it also had a circle of runes inscribed around the bottom of it. The SS was deeply into runic occultism. And so it's not surprising that they would have put something like this, some kind of incantation around the bottom of the bell. And this is what was described at Kecksburg. And of course, this object was carried away by the U.S. military on a flatbed truck.
And if I recall, we're talking 1965?
December 1965. So
long after the Nazis'
2 decades.
Yeah.
And you would think that if this program, as Joseph Farrell and others have suggested, if this program, Project Kronos, continued in Argentina or wherever else, after 2 decades, it wouldn't still be a 10-foot tall object right, with exactly the same characteristics as it had in the prototype that they were working with in the 1940s. There would have been some development. Mm-hmm. So some people have suggested that perhaps this object traveled in time, that, this was a mid to late 1940s bell that wound up in rural Pennsylvania in the 1960s.
And as I recall, you mentioned that plants that were in the vicinity of the bell when it was operated began to degenerate very quickly.
Yeah, this thing, Nick Cook writes about it in the context of zero-point energy research because it was an anti-gravity device as well. They had to chain it down because when it would be activated, it would levitate. And it would have a bluish glow around it. And yes, it would have these degenerative effects on organisms and cause a distortion in the flow of time for the human participants.
Now, it's probably worth mentioning at this point some of the observations I have made and other people I know personally have made with Uri Geller, the Israeli psychic who has been known, I personally witnessed, you put a bean sprout in his hand, and as you watch and concentrate on it, the sprout will actually grow into a bean right in front of your eyes in a matter of maybe 1 minute.
Yeah, and that highlights, again, the connection between psychic phenomena and time travel. That, whatever the bell was doing could be understood. Well, people may be trying to understand it in entirely materialistic terms and in physics terms, as the opening of a supermassive vortex through some kind of a transmutation of the mercury thorium compound that's inside the counter-rotating cylinders. That somehow this compound, when it's properly stressed and shocked, opens up a vortex in space-time. But I wonder whether whether this is an entirely physical process within the paradigm of materialist physics that is established today.
Now, since I brought up the Uri Geller story of the bean sprout, I should tell the sequel story. My friend Saul Paul Sarag, has been a good friend of mine for the last 40 years, was studying Uri Geller and knew about the bean sprout demonstrations he'd done and wanted to surprise him with a test of his own. So on one occasion, Geller was not expecting anything from him. He handed him a sprout, a bean sprout that had already sprouted, a mung bean sprout, and told him, make the movie run backwards. Geller held it in his hand for a moment, and when he opened his hand, it was no longer a bean sprout, it was a mung bean.
Yes, and so, I have to wonder whether achieving time travel is ultimately going to require a fusion of certain parapsychological techniques together with technology, potentially. The bell had lethal effects on the humans in its environs. But if it's opening up a vortex in space-time, then perhaps that would make it easier for somebody to astral project into the past or the future through the vortex that's opened up. Because, the Germans, after all, were pioneers in remote viewing and other types of psychic research. They were using what we now call remote viewing to track British naval vessels regularly across the Atlantic. And they also used the same techniques to pinpoint Mussolini and extract him when he was being held by the Allies and bring him back to Germany. That operation that Otto Skorzeny carried out was all based on intelligence provided by clairvoyance.
And this is reported by scholars now who have looked into it?
Yeah, Peter Levenda talks about this at length in his book on Nazi interest in the occult. And it appears that the Soviet psychotronics program and American psychic research were both inspired by what was discovered when they went into Germany and realized the kind of research that the Nazis had been carrying.
Well, I think it's only fair to point out, however, that accounts like this can even be found in the Bible. There's good reason to think that throughout history there have been examples.
Sure. And that's the case. one question that's also posed by, the extreme antiquity of some of these artifacts that Cremo and Thompson discuss in Forbidden Archaeology is whether, if to some extent they're correct that there were exceedingly ancient human civilizations, perhaps those civilizations were themselves seeded from out of the future. One thing that's always puzzled me is why the evidence for Atlantis is so isolated, is so geographically isolated. There are these incredible, astonishingly complex ruins, extremely sophisticated architecture on a titanic scale, but they're found only in very small pockets. And when Colin Wilson co-authored with Rand Flemeth a book on Atlantis, he suggested that the island continent Plato was describing in Timaeus and Critias was really Antarctica, that Antarctica really fit the bill, and that it's only after an Earth crustal slippage took place that Antarctica wound up entirely inside the southern polar region. Earlier, at least half of it was exposed in the latitude of Argentina, where Argentina is today. And so, if Antarctica was Atlantis, you'd have to ask yourself why they limited themselves, at least for a long time, to that part of the world. And one explanation is that these were time travelers who were quarantining themselves to prevent contaminating the timeline. That at least for some time, they adhered to an ethic of not interfering in the normal evolution of human history. And their extremely advanced knowledge and technology is explainable on account of the fact that they were from the future. This might also be an explanation for the evidence from Martian civilization. When Viking came back with photographs of pyramids and an apparent face on Mars, and then when ultimately John Brandenburg discovered what he interprets to be radiological evidence for a massive nuclear war on Mars dating to 250 million years ago, not incidentally the same epoch as some of those artifacts discussed in Forbidden Archaeology, one has to wonder whether Mars might have been a refuge for time travelers. If you knew that Mars was as alive as Earth in the distant past, it's now been confirmed that Mars once had a biosphere similar to that of the Earth, and in hundreds of millions of years ago. And so, if a time-traveling civilization in the human future wanted to go somewhere in our solar system that would be habitable, but that would allow them to isolate themselves from the timeline that led to human evolution on the Earth, so that they didn't interfere with that, in ways that were unpredictable, Mars might be the perfect place to choose. And on the other hand, if a decision were made to no longer adhere to that ethic and to begin interfering in the timeline of evolution on Earth and to colonize the Earth, you could see how that might be corrected by erasing the civilization on Mars, that such an extreme decision as the one that would have produced the kind of nuclear war that Brandenburg sees evidence for would be made potentially to preserve the evolutionary timeline on the Earth that eventually gave rise to Homo sapiens.
Well, my understanding is that Brandenburg is simply reporting on a NASA finding that there's extraordinary radiation on Mars. It's hard to account for. It might have been the result of a massive nuclear, thousands and thousands and thousands of nuclear bombs exploding on Mars. Or I've heard some people suggest maybe one distant time our sun was part of a double star system, and that Mars was radiated from perhaps Jupiter was at one time giving off radiation at a massive level. So there's so many mysteries. I know one area that you've explored, Jason, is the question of if it's possible to change the past. Many people say that the best explanation for that would be the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, and you take issue with that.
Yeah, I do, because I think that the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics doesn't allow us to change anything in the present. If all of our decisions are nothing more than probabilistic outcomes of events that take place on a quantum level in the quantum computer that is our brain, and that every time a wave function collapses, it collapses in any way that it could. In multiple universes, so that, for each outcome of a probability distribution on the quantum level, there's a universe in which it's resolved, right? That means that there, in any given second, there are a number of parallel universes branching off from this one.
Yeah.
And there are worlds in which we make every decision that we possibly could have in this life.
Virtually uncountable new universes every nanosecond.
Right.
Yes.
So that makes nonsense out of, the kind of personal agency that is responsible for choices, for making choices and for deciding to make changes in the present in any way. Mm-hmm. So I think it's nonsense to, on a logical level, on the level of logical coherence, to propose the many worlds interpretation as an explanation for, what's happening, where someone comes from the future and changes events in the past to prevent themselves from even having been born. With the idea being that, well, they're simply from a parallel universe. They're not from the universe where they made the changes that resulted in their not having been born. It doesn't make any sense, because there's not enough of a notion of agency present in the context of the many worlds interpretation of quantum theory. I think what makes a lot more sense is if we take the simulation hypothesis seriously, as Philip K. Dick did, and we think of alternate timelines as versions of a game that are stored on a cloud server. So, video games today can be saved up to a certain point. And you can go back to that past state of play and replay the game forward in a different way than you chose to initially.
We should point out at this point in our discussion, we're starting to build on our previous conversation about virtual reality. So, for viewers who haven't watched that video, if you really want to follow carefully where we're going now, it would be very useful to watch it. And I'm going to link to it. There'll be a link in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you haven't watched it, I recommend it.
Yes. And so I think that when you think about the metaphysics that would be required to make sense out of going into the past and changing it, you have to presuppose that there's something like a fifth dimension in relation to our four-dimensional space-time, and that there are a variety of 4D space-time continua that are accessible from a fifth dimension. And the only way to concretely conceive of that is, or at least one way that it's occurred to me to concretely conceive of that, is of different states of play in a simulation being saved on a server inside the world where the simulation is being programmed. And we have a perfect analogy to that in terms of the video games and massively multiplayer simulacra that exist today. And this is not a totally hypothetical scenario either, going into the past and changing it, because there are a few cases where this was actually attempted, or at least there are attempts made to change the course of events based on knowledge of the future. And one of them was related to me by Lynn Buchanan, who was a prominent trainer in the U.S. remote viewing program.
Lynn Buchanan, who's been a guest on this program many times. And
he said that after 9/11, he was tasked with seeing the next 9/11. And he led a small group of people who foresaw an attack on the southeastern coast of the United States. I think it was Georgia, although it might have been the Carolinas. An attack by terrorists coming in from the Atlantic Ocean and hitting a populated coastal area with biological weapons. And he was able to determine the exact day and time that this attack would take place, so that when that day came around, the Coast Guard was sent out and did intercept these terrorists inbound to the coastal cities with this pathogen that they were going to disperse, and prevented the event from taking place. Well, the question that poses metaphysically is, where did Len get the information from in the first place? What world was that? I mean, what kind of reality, what ontological status does the world have that he got that information from, the world where the second 9/11 took place, but that doesn't in fact come to pass because of his intervention? Mm. And so again, I would suggest that, the simulation hypothesis is a reasonable way to make sense out of this.
And when you say that, I don't think you literally mean that there are invisible computer programmers controlling our 4D space, but more that somehow our universe operates as if that were the case.
It may be. I mean, in another discussion, we've talked about the holographic universe theory, and that would lend itself to that interpretation. Mm-hmm. I think one thing that we haven't talked about is, time travel into the future, by using spacecraft that travel at near the speed of light. And this is the kind of scenario that you see in the original Planet of the Apes.
That's perfectly consistent with Einsteinian relativity.
It's the most unobjectionable and conventionally accepted version of time travel. Mm-hmm. And it's a scenario that's in the original Planet of the Apes, where this early interstellar spacecraft malfunctions so that the people in hibernation don't wake up when they were supposed to. And when they do wake up, because they've been traveling at the speed of light away from the Earth, hundreds and hundreds of years have passed by on the Earth. And by the time they turn around and get back to our planet, it is a planet governed by intelligent apes, where human beings have regressed into savagery. Interestingly, in the sequel to Planet of the Apes, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, it's revealed that there is this breakaway human civilization that actually was mutated by the atomic war, that devastated humanity and gave rise to the civilization of intelligent apes. And this hidden civilization of telepathic mutants is actually controlling the ape society and manipulating it in various ways. Well, the only reason I mention that is because this idea of the bifurcation of humanity, this bifurcated evolution of humanity in the future, is also present in H.G. Wells' famous Time Machine novel, and with the first popular treatment of time travel in science fiction. He also has this vision of a differentiation of humanity into a sort of subhuman Morlock species and a superhuman Eloi species.
Yeah, one lives underground, one lives above ground, and if I recall correctly, the Morlocks feed on the Eloi.
That's right. And so the thing about time traveling into the future by using spacecraft traveling at near the speed of light, that is worth considering in terms of possible empirical evidence for time travel, is that I've never been able to understand why the Mayans needed a long count calendar that operated with such huge cycles, and how it was so precise. The times were measured at precision to so many decimal points, as if modern computers were making the calculations behind this calendar. Well, you would need that kind of calendar, this kind of, calendar where a single year is thousands of our years. You would need that type of long count calendar if you were a civilization routinely engaging in space flight near the speed of light. Mm-hmm. And every time you went out away from the Earth and then came back, hundreds of years would have elapsed. That's the kind of time scale you would have needed to think in terms of if you were, operating that type of space program and effectively regularly engaging in time travel to the future.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, the Hindus also had a very large-scale cosmology involving millions, hundreds of millions of years.
They did, and so you have to wonder whether this is an inheritance from a civilization in the distant past that was seeded by people from the distant future.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess what we can say at this point is there's an awful lot of fictional accounts and explorations of time travel possibilities. We could probably easily name and enjoy reminiscing over another dozen movies and Star Trek episodes and so on. And there are these scraps of evidence that we have that suggest on an empirical basis that time travel or time portals of some sort may very well be real. Too bad we don't have an actual time machine in our studio here.
I don't know that it's too bad, because see, the thing is, again, this is the most destructive technology imaginable. You know, the Germans classified Project Kronos as kriegsentscheidend, decisive for the war. It was a top secret level of classification that wasn't given to any other project in Nazi Germany. Mm. And you have to wonder what they meant by that, kriegsentscheidend, when they call something Project Time. A time machine would be the ultimate weapon. I mean, you also see this in the Terminator saga.
Yes.
That effectively that is what Fritz Lieber called the change war. It is a war to revise history. You see this particularly in Terminator 2, when, you know, the first successful attempt is made to change the past. Mm. And then, you know, they over and over again, the two sides engage in attempts to revise history. So if this technology is achievable, or if it has been achieved, it would be the most closely guarded secret, because it would be the single technology that would be most destabilizing to society.
If it was technological, I think it's fair to say if you dig into the accounts of remote viewing experiments in this area, it's quite clear that remote viewers are able to view things in both the past and the future. That when Joe McMoneagle refers to it as the ultimate time machine, it's not 100% accurate by any means. Even Joe McMoneagle, one of the great all-time remote viewers, has predictions in that book that haven't been borne out. Nonetheless, I view it like Babe Ruth, you know, the greatest baseball batter of all time, who struck out more often than he had home runs, but it was still a world-class home run champion. I think remote viewing operates kind of that way. So I think we have good data.
I agree. And you say, well, if it's technological, but actually these are not mutually exclusive.
Right.
And I think one of the reasons why remote viewing and parapsychology research in general has been so severely marginalized is because of the at least subconscious fear that it could open the door to something like the change war. Yeah. That the effects would be so destabilizing to society if we were to rigorously understand and be able to control these abilities.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jason, Reza Jorjani, you are a very brave philosopher to venture into these areas and to do it with such precision and such articulation. It's always a pleasure to have these conversations with you. And if I may, let me just take a moment and talk to our viewers, because many of you know that Jason has been defamed and that he's lost his teaching career at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, where his students and his philosophy of technology courses love the work that he does. We have set up a GoFundMe page for Jason. It's very important that he receives ongoing funding, because he is working very hard at writing new books on these topics relating parapsychology and technology. You'll find links to the GoFundMe page in the comments section after each of my videos with Jason, and I encourage you to check out those links and donate generously. And Jason, once again, my very heartfelt thank you to you for coming to Albuquerque and being with me to share these conversations.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure, Jeffrey. Thank you for the opportunity, as always.
And thank you for being with us.